Welcome to the debate. When we look at the evolution of comparative politics, especially in the aftermath of World War II, the defining feature is this profound methodological split. CP was really trying to define itself as a true social science, but it immediately ran into a tension between studying the rigid, formal systems of government and, well, studying the dynamic, empirical behavior of the people operating within or sometimes against those systems.
And that methodological chasm is exactly what moved the discipline forward out of its traditional, mostly descriptive phase. I mean, we're talking about the difference between charting the organization of a ministry versus actually measuring the trust citizens have in that ministry. So the core question then is, which of these approaches gives us the more robust and comprehensive understanding of global politics?
Precisely. We're debating whether the primary focus of comparative politics should be on formal political systems and institutional structures, so the realm of systems theory and neo-institutionalism, or if true insight demands prioritizing individual and group behavior, culture, and these underlying dynamic social forces, as championed by the behavioral revolution and political sociology.
And I'll be arguing that meaningful political insight demands we build our analysis from the ground up. It has to be based on empirical human behavior and the underlying social realities that ultimately shape, constrain, and sometimes just outright ignore formal structures.
And I will argue for the necessity of systemic and institutional frameworks. They provide the authoritative structures that are required for scientific rigor and, crucially, the necessary boundaries for any meaningful cross-national comparison. Look, I see why you think that. But effective comparative analysis, it has to prioritize the political system as the overarching authoritative framework. The moment we lose sight of that formal structure, we lose the analytical distinctiveness of politics. David Easton's systems approach was a very deliberate attempt to professionalize the discipline, to establish comparative politics as a true scientific enterprise where results could be uniformly applicable and testable across different nations.
Easton's ambition was massive, I'll grant you. But the initial application was pretty static.
But it provided the essential analytical scaffolding. The system is defined by those, persistent patterns of relationships among people and institutions. And it features that famous input-output mechanism. And what does that mechanism give us? It gives us a self-regulating logic for change and adjustment. Demands, our inputs, are converted into policy outputs, which then creates feedback. And critically, this framework clearly defined politics as the authoritative allocation of values for a society. I mean, that phrase is everything. It separates politics from general social science because it focuses on legitimacy and enforcement. Without that boundary, we're just studying sociology.
That's a fair assessment of the goal, sure, but it raises the whole post-behavioralist problem of relevance, doesn't it?
Well, let me just finish by saying that neo-institutionalism addresses that main structural critique. Scopel's powerful call to bring the state back in corrected the earlier limitations that, treated the state as just a neutral conversion box. It asserts that state institutions are autonomous actors, that they're capable of having their own interests and genuinely constraining political actors. This framework ensures we focus on the enduring rules and procedures that determine who wins and who loses, regardless of who is temporarily in power. That structural view endures.
I come at it from a completely different way. Focusing exclusively on those formal systems, even refined ones, risks returning us to the formalist and static traps that plagued traditional CP before the 1950s. I mean, if all we study are institutional flowcharts, we miss the actual drivers of power. True political understanding has to be built from the foundation of empirical human behavior and the deeply influential social forces at play.
So you're prioritizing the behavioral revolution over systemic thought?
Absolutely. But not just the quantitative methodology, it's the philosophical shift. Charles Merriam, the architect of the behavioral revolution, insisted we sideline these purely normative or prescriptive studies in favor of quantification, statistics, and most importantly, empirical investigation into human relations. This focus on observable, measurable behavior is what transformed CP into a policy-relevant field. A great example of this dividend is the political culture approach. Almond and Verba's civic culture provided the essential psychological dimension of political systems, measuring attitudes like political trust, efficacy, and participation.
But that still leaves the structures themselves largely unexamined.
Not at all. Lucian Pye defined political culture as the crucial bridge. It links micro-level political behavior, so individual beliefs, to macro-level political institutions, like regime stability. To illustrate, you can have two countries with identical written constitutions, but one is a high-trust society and the other is a low-trust society. Their political outcomes, the stability of their democracy, the efficacy of their policies, will be radically different. And that difference is measurable behavior, not institutional text.
But now you're moving away from the state entirely.
No, we're grounding the state in reality. Approaches like political sociology, championed by someone like S.M. Lipset, explicitly start with society and examine how it shapes and impacts the state. We look at how informal institutions, caste, religion, linguistic groups, social class operate and exercise power in ways the formal constitution just never anticipates. This social reduction of politics is absolutely necessary, especially in developing societies like India or much of sub-Saharan Africa, where political mobilization is so often defined by social cleavages, not parliamentary procedure. We have to study the social reality first to understand the efficacy of the state structure second.
Okay, let's move to our first major point of friction. This goal of scientific rigor and universal application. David Easton's objective was methodologically specific. He wanted CP to produce results that are uniformly applicable and testable across cases. Systems theory provides that comprehensive template. It looks beyond the unique form of the state to examine political systems as a whole, focusing on processes and linkages between the system and its environment. So my question is, how can behavioral analysis, which relies so heavily on subjective survey data, on attitude measurements, how can it achieve this level of universal testable rigor?
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the pursuit of methodological perfection should trump substantive relevance. You're highlighting the early, ambitious, and frankly, sometimes naive phase of the behavioral revolution. That pursuit of perfection was precisely the criticism Easton himself leveled in the late 1960s, which led to the post-behavioralist shift.
And what was his criticism?
He argued that focusing too strictly on technique and methodological rigor, being scientistic, had begun to stifle research. It was drawing researchers away from crucial, normative, urgent real-world problems. We risked becoming, as he put it, empirically verifiable but substantively irrelevant. The famous critique by Liphart against political culture was exactly this, that survey data on attitudes is too soft, it's fleeting, it's prone to cultural bias, and it can't serve as a reliable predictive basis. And I agree with that critique if behavioralism stops there.
But it often did.
And that's why the behavioral framework had to evolve, grounding its science in verifiable material mechanisms. We learned from the Marxist critics of early behavioralism, for instance, who insisted that if you want scientific prediction, you have to focus on the material conditions in class conflict that structure power, not just subjective political attitudes. Our science must illuminate the realities of who gets what, when, and how, which requires empirical assessment of power relations, not just the abstract structure that frames them.
That's a noble goal, but the system approach is already designed to capture those material realities. Inputs are often economic demands, and outputs are regulatory policies. The structural framework provides the testable mechanism for how those demands are converted. If you focus only on the behavior, you can describe the conflict, sure, but you struggle to model the institutional variables that determine the resolution of that conflict.
Mathematical models fulfilling your desire for rigor, yet it is equally criticized for neglecting normative considerations. The point is not that quantitative rigor is bad. It's that structural rigor, without deep empirical grounding in political culture and social reality, just leaves you with an empty model. The system can only convert inputs it recognizes. If a powerful social force uses channels outside the formal system, your model fails.
But if we agree that politics is the authoritative allocation of values, then the state and its institutions are the source of that authority. We have to analyze that first.
Okay, let's pivot to the issue of generalizability, or maybe the danger of ethnocentrism. That's an interesting point you make about the structure's neutrality, but have you considered that systems theory and structural functional approaches were historically heavily criticized for being inherently ethnocentric? They were based predominantly on generalized models of stable, usually Western, political systems.
That's a historical fact regarding the initial application, yes.
And a deep methodological bias. Sidney Verba himself summarized a goal of modern comparative politics as needing to look beyond the countries of Western Europe to the new nations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. If you start with the presumption of a stable, differentiated input-output system, you fundamentally misdiagnose politics in a society where, say, ethnic identity is the defining political cleavage. That's why approaches like political sociology are explicitly necessary.
How so?
Because political sociology, particularly in the tradition of scholars like Rajni Kotari and India, it focuses on the mechanisms of social mobilization. It analyzes how these enduring social structures, caste, linguistic groups, religious identities, become the actual vehicles for political power and patronage. In these developing contexts, the formal constitution is often secondary to these deep, informal institutions. We can trace how social stratification becomes political stratification. A systems model is just ill-equipped to handle that reality, because its foundational assumptions about differentiated structures are violated from the start.
The ethnocentrism critique against early functionalism is valid, and I'll concede that the initial American focus was a major stumbling block. However, the problem lies in the application, not the systemic framework itself. Structural functional analysis, as refined by Ullman, specifically provides a rigorous, abstract methodology for identifying universal functions like interest articulation, aggregation, rule adjudication, and then analyzing the specific structures, formal or informal, that perform them in any given political system. It gives us a means to compare the functioning of, say, a traditional clan council versus a modern parliament. The categories for comparison are neutral, even if the early case studies were not.
But your analysis still carries a deep bias towards system maintenance and stability. It implies that the goal of all these structures is just to function smoothly.
Not necessarily. Furthermore, neo-institutionalism arose precisely because approaches that started entirely with society, like political sociology, faced that devastating criticism of social reductionism. Samuel Huntington criticized this view for reducing complex political events to mere social byproducts, seeing revolutions as inevitable class struggles, for example, and thereby ignoring the state's autonomous role.
And why is that autonomy so crucial?
Because the state, especially its bureaucratic and military apparatus, has institutional interests that are independent of the ruling social class or culture. When Skopel demanded we bring the state back in, it was a direct challenge to the idea that the state is just a reflection of class interests. Think about a major economic crisis. The way the state bureaucracy responds, based on institutional capacity, legal procedure, and its own internal history, is often independent of the immediate demands of the political culture or social groups. Ignoring that institutional autonomy prevents us from understanding why two identical societies might have radically different government responses to the exact same crisis. If we don't assert the state's independence, we effectively dissolve comparative politics into general sociology. Let's transition to the third core point, the dynamic nature of political change. A major persistent critique of purely behavioral and cultural studies is their tendency to be static or ahistorical. They often treat culture or class structure or group identity as a kind of fixed attribute that predicts behavior. The systems approach, conversely, inherently accounts for dynamism through its negative feedback mechanism. It is constantly adjusting policies and decisions based on environmental inputs, public feedback through elections, social audits, media scrutiny. This mechanism shows how the system maintains and regulates itself in response to its environment, which is essential for understanding long-term political stability.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning, because the systems approach and structural functional analysis are consistently criticized for their status quoist nature. They are excellent at modeling adaptive change, how a system tweaks a budget or replaces a leader, but they utterly fail to address the dynamics of fundamental transformation or revolution.
That's a strong claim. What defines the failure?
The failure is in the assumption of equilibrium. The system always tries to return to equilibrium, but what happens when the demands placed on the system are so overwhelming or contradictory that the system itself collapses? The input-output model struggles to explain deep institutional rupture, like the dissolution of the Soviet Union or the collapse of a democratic regime into authoritarianism. Only behavioral and societal forces which analyze ideological shifts, mass mobilization, and class alignments can truly illuminate those moments.
But that is exactly what neo-institutionalism corrects. By defining the state as an autonomous actor with its own structural interests, neo-institutionalism can explain why states resist or fail to adapt to popular demands, which ultimately leads to system collapse. It's an institutional failure, not merely a societal one.
I disagree. Political behavior drives fundamental change. It forces the institutional hand. Let's just return to the example of the massive farmers' movement in India in 2020-21. You had a democratic state, a functioning legislature, a majority government that passed 3 farm laws, all adhering perfectly to formal procedures. A purely systemic view would treat the agitation that followed as just a surge in demands that should be processed.
And the system processed them by eventually repealing the laws. That's the feedback loop working.
No, that's where the systemic analysis falls completely short. The repeal was not the smooth output of some regulating mechanism. It was the result of a prolonged, massive societal resistance. Informal institutions like farming unions, caste associations, mobilized community networks that placed so much extramural pressure on the government that the formal institutional output was fundamentally realigned. Political sociology is uniquely equipped to analyze how those societal cleavages translate into sustained resistance that overrides formal state legislation. Behavior in that instance was not just an input. It was the effective policymaker.
But you're defining the exception as the rule. For the vast majority of political analysis, the system processes demands in a predictable, stable fashion. Focusing solely on the revolutionary rupture misses the underlying stable structures that allow political life to continue on a daily basis. To understand why a system endures, which is a key question in comparative politics, you must analyze its regulating mechanism. To understand why India didn't collapse during that crisis, you have to look at the persistence of its democratic institutions and procedures.
But to understand why the farmers succeeded where other movements have failed, you must look at the specific social structure, the group cohesion, and the cultural dimensions of that mobilization, which is a behavioral question.
So to summarize my position, the structural reality of politics, the definition of legitimate authoritative power, is fundamentally institutional and systemic. While I acknowledge the crucial value of behavioral insights for filling in the functional details, we have to maintain a macro-level analytical distinctiveness. David Easton stressed this point. Comparative politics gains its strength from its ability to offer universally applicable analysis, and this is achieved by defining and understanding the enduring structures and systems that convert societal inputs into authoritative outputs. If we lose the focus on the system, we lose our disciplinary clarity and our ability to compare 2 radically different regimes, like a modern democracy and a tribal society, on a common conceptual ground.
And conversely, we cannot generate relevant, accurate political outcomes without first grappling with the underlying cultural beliefs, the individual behaviors, and the powerful social forces that influence and often dictate the action of the state. As S.M. Lipset argued, political sociology must begin with society and examine its influence on the state. By integrating the insights from the behavioral revolution, so rigorous empirical investigation into human relations, we move beyond the descriptive formalism and the ethnocentrism that plagued earlier approaches. This ensures our analysis illuminates the true complexity of political life globally, especially when we're studying informal power dynamics and radical political change.
It seems clear that both the pursuit of rigorous systemic models and the deep empirical exploration of political behavior were necessary responses to the limitations of traditional comparative politics.
Indeed, the material demonstrates that a comprehensive understanding requires analysts to constantly navigate the tension between these 2 essential perspectives, allowing the discipline to remain relevant, rigorous, and responsive to the complexity of the political world.